It's hard to pinpoint when exactly the development of the Gelgoog began, but it's assumed that the first drafts were already being made relatively early into the One-Year War. After the failure of Operation British, the Zeon High Command realized that this would not be the swift and decisive victory that they had hoped for. As a result, they would need to think about the future. Now, the Zaku 2 was no doubt an amazing mobile suit, and it managed to absolutely wipe the floor with the Federation for a variety of reasons. At the same time though, the Zaku 2 was actually already kind of an old design. The first model of the Zaku 1 was rolled out in UC0074, and incremental upgrades would lead to those Zaku 2s that we see in UC0079. Zeon quickly realized that with the changing state of the war, they would need a new main mobile suit. On the ground, we first see this happening with the Goof and the Dom. But Zeon also wanted a true successor to the Zaku, another state-of-the-art masterpiece that would become a symbol for Zeon. And it's exactly because of this desire that the Gelgoog's early development was so very muddy. In the early days, it was assigned to model number MS-11, a model number that we now associate with an entirely different mobile suit, the Act Zaku. We'll come back to this in a second. So, during the time that the Gelgoog was just known as the MS-11, it was being developed as a mobile suit with potential future Federation mobile suits in mind. But because Zeon didn't really know what these hypothetical Federation mobile suits would look like, they could really only base their assumptions on what was out there. Their own Zaku 2. So one of the things that they seemingly decided to focus on was increasing mobility. Which then brings us back to the Act Zaku. I feel like the most common theory for its model number is that it was meant to conceal the secret nature of the Act Zaku. It was part of the Peasant Project, which was a top-secret weapon development plan carried out at the Peasant asteroid base. And to keep all of the machines that were being developed there a secret, they were given a model number of a mobile suit that was either cancelled or changed. For example, due to its numerous delays, the Gelgoog's model number was changed from MS-11 to MS-14. And so, the Act Zaku was given the now free model number MS-11. However, there's also a second theory that I find both much more interesting and also more likely. The theory begins by pointing out that if you really look at it, the Act Zaku and the Gelgoog both fulfill a very similar role as successor units to the Zaku 2. They're a bit too similar in fact, almost as if they had some kind of connection to each other than that shared model number. Enter the RX-78-2 Gundam. As I said before, Zeon was working on the MS-11 based on what they thought Federation mobile suits would look like, which was based on their own Zaku 2. The introduction of the RX-78-2 completely shattered their predictions, and let's just say that the Gundam didn't earn the nickname the White Devil for nothing. It completely outclassed anything Zeon had at the time, including the MS-11 that was still in development. The Gundam was highly mobile, heavily armored, and most importantly, capable of using handheld beam weaponry. If, or rather, when this thing was mass-produced, Zeon would be in major trouble if they didn't have anything to counter it. As a result, the MS-11 project was basically restarted from scratch. It now needed to be beam capable and be able to stand up to the RX-78-2 Gundam. This new upheaval then would eventually lead to the MS-14 Gelgoog that we now all know and love. But what happened to all of that data and all of that development that was happening before this upheaval? Well, according to our second theory, all of this would be given to the peasant asteroid base. The idea being that it would make for a good jumping off point for their mobile suit development plans. Further developing a, let's say, half-finished mobile suit would give them some really good experience. This would then result in the Act Zaku, and it was given the model number MS-11 because, well, it was the finished version of the mobile suit that was originally going to be the MS-11 anyways. So, to summarize, according to this theory, the original prototype for the Gelgoog was a prototype Act Zaku. But because the RX-78-2 Gundam appeared, this prototype Act Zaku was abandoned, and work instead began on what we now know as the Gelgoog. At some point then, this prototype Act Zaku, or whatever they had of it, was delivered to the peasant asteroid base, where they then began upgrading it to the Act Zaku that we now all know. Unfortunately, we don't know what the prototype looked like, or even to what point it was completed. But we do know that this was the end result. The MS-11 Act Zaku, a machine with incredible agility thanks to a surprising piece of technology, the magnet coating. Developed by the Federation, this special coating decreased friction significantly, allowing the joints to move much faster. What's so surprising about this then is that 1. This was cutting-edge Federation technology, and yet here we have Zeon using it, and 2. This means that the Act Zaku was equipped with different Federation-style joints. The magnet coating is only compatible with Federation-style driver systems, which utilized field motors, whereas Zeon mobile suits, minus the Act Zaku then, used a fluid pulse system. I'm definitely interested in how Zeon could have gotten their hands on this technology, but most sources do agree that the magnet coating was present on the Act Zaku when it was rolled out. Maybe the Federation should have been using NordVPN to better protect their online activity, the sponsor of today's video. Not only will they increase your online security, but they'll also help you dodge all of those pesky region locks, which is why I'm using NordVPN on a daily basis. And by using the link down below, or the code kkrt, you'll not just get a sweet discount, but you'll also be directly supporting the channel. In terms of weapons then, it also managed to impress. Given how it was scrapped when it was decided that beam weapons needed to be part of the Gelgoog, I would say that it's safe to assume that the original MS-11 prototype was not able to use beam weapons, or at the very least, they thought that it wouldn't be able to use beam weapons. The peasant engineers, though, managed to make it work by simply installing a stronger reactor. And so the Act Zaku did get its own beam rifle, made by the Albert Corporation. How it looked, though, varies from source to source. At first, it was usually depicted like this: a beam rifle sharing similarities with the BR-87A beam rifle. But later on, it's a beam rifle that's almost identical to the BR-87A beam rifle. Whichever version you want to go with though, this beam rifle would then eventually be developed into the BR-87A beam rifle made by the BOA Corporation. Its other purpose-built weapons then were a new type of heat hawk with a larger blade, and a very unique looking conventional bullpup machine gun. And just like with the beam rifle, we've got two different designs for this thing, although here they do look mostly the same. We've got 4 barrels fed by a very bulky magazine on the side. The difference then is the placement and function of the two handles. In the original design, both handles are on the bottom, with the front one having the trigger. Later designs then go a bit more conventional, with only one handle on the bottom, being the one with the trigger, and the secondary handle being on the side. Also, during the real-life planning stages, 2 more weapons were designed and planned to become part of the Act Zaku's arsenal, but these would eventually be dropped. There's this unique-looking cracker grenade and a beam bazooka with a handle that looks almost identical to the handle of that of the Zaku machine gun. I don't think the Cracker Grenade got used for anything, but the Beam Bazooka was. Its lore got changed to an upgrade of the Giant Bazooka, and it became the main weapon for the Peasant OH. Despite all of these new weapons then, and its high performance, the Act Zaku was still said to be very easy to produce, just like its legendary predecessor, the Zaku 2. And the reason that was cited for this was because the Act Zaku was made with the United Maintenance Plan in mind, a plan that was aimed at standardizing various parts of Zeon's sometimes very different mobile suits. As such, it could also use most of Zeon's other handheld weapons like the Zaku machine gun. And what it also had was a mounting point for a shield, like for example that of the Gelgoog, and of course the option to have a commander antenna. So overall, the Act Zaku was said to be an enormous success. It was just too little, too late. By the time that the Act Zaku was ready to roll, the war was all but over. As a result, we don't have a lot of information on its deployment during the war. The stories that we do have, though, paint a very clear picture. The Act Zaku was a deadly machine capable of extremely high performance in the right hands. For example, in the April 2000 issue of Dengeki Hobby, it was said that the magnet coating improved the Act Zaku's performance to such a degree that the operating system couldn't keep up, and they unfortunately weren't able to fix these issues before the war ended. A more famous story then is the Space to the End of a Flash side story. Here a commander-type Act Zaku appears, piloted by Mallet Sanguine, an ace pilot who's also the leader of Granada's Special Forces. According to this story, the Act Zaku's performance was so high that it needed a limiter to be installed for it to be used by regular humans. Mallet then takes performance-enhancing drugs so that he could remove these limiters and use the Act Zaku to its full deadly potential. But so, the war would end before the Act Zaku could be deployed in any meaningful numbers. But this wasn't the end for the Act Zaku. The Federation would take a keen interest in certain Zeon mobile suits to bolster their own forces. Production facilities for the Act Zaku were captured pretty much intact, and the Act Zaku would be pushed into production with very little changes. Most sources agree that it was simply upgraded with a panoramic monitor and a linear seat, and that its weapons were also slightly changed. As mentioned earlier, the beam rifle got developed into the BR-87A beam rifle. It could use the same shield as that of the Hizack, and it now had 2 beam sabers, although it's not known where exactly these are stored. Some other sources then say that the magnet coating was also a post-war upgrade by the Federation, or at the very least that it was perfected by the Federation. In data collection number 4, Zeta Gundam Volume 1, they just straight up say that the magnet coating was applied by the Federation after the 1-year war. And then in the aforementioned April 2000 issue of Dengeki Hobby, they say that Zeon did apply it, but that they had those issues with the operating system, which were then resolved by the Federation by the time that the Grips War rolled around. Another thing then that we sometimes get some conflicting reports on is to which degree the Act Zaku was produced and then subsequently deployed. What we know for certain is that it wasn't produced anywhere near the numbers of the Federation's other mass production units, like for example the Jim 2, the Hizack, or the Garibaldi Beta. But then other sources narrow this down even further. In the anime, we only see them appearing as escort units for the Gapland, so it's sometimes said that the Act Zaku, as a highly mobile machine, was exclusively used by the Augusta base as an escort unit for their highly mobile armors. A theory then that we get some confirmation on from another Act machine called the Act Hizack from the UC Engage smartphone game. The upgrades to this thing include magnet coating and other internal upgrades specifically to make it work alongside the Act Zaku's and to support those aforementioned transformable mobile armors. So depending on how specific you want to be about the Act Zaku, its deployment ranges from being a limited mass production unit, to an escort machine for transformable mobile armors, to specifically being an escort machine for transformable mobile armors operating from the Augusta base. The Titans would then give the Act Zaku one final upgrade. Kinda. One of their big things was compatibility, especially for backpacks and optional equipment, something that this chart for the Fruity 2 and its equipment beautifully shows. Newly built mobile suits like the Hizack and the Hazels could freely change their backpacks with one another, so they could easily switch to a backpack that was natively compatible with that Fruity 2. But the Fruity 2 also had a backup connection. It could clamp itself to the crotch and the shoulders of pretty much any mobile suit. New machines like the Gapflay and the Humbrabi, but also older machines like the Galbaldi Beta and the Act Zaku. This then gave those machines access to all of the optional equipment that could be mounted onto the Fruity 2, like the gigantic arms unit, or its developments like the Aqua Humbrabi 2. This then turned the Act Zaku into the Act Zaku Raw 2 Aqua, or Aqua as they spelled it here. Now, it is important to keep in mind that this thing was never officially confirmed to have seen any combat, and it is very possible that this combination was simply made to show that it could be done, not that it should be done. After the Grips War then, the Federation would seemingly discontinue the Act Zaku, but it would still pop up a few more times with other groups. Like for example, Char's newly formed Neo Zeon in UC 0090. Here, a squadron of 3 Act Zakus can be seen supporting the Tive class Tikal and the Endra class Milandra. And then already the last time that we see the Act Zaku was around UC 110. At least one unit was used by a group of space pirates calling themselves the Golden Eagles. Its pilot was a boy named Misma Muerte, but he didn't willingly join the pirates, and his only reason for fighting was staying alive. Now then, let's go back in time for some Act Zaku variants and developments. The first one is the video game only Act Zaku Sniper type. It appeared in Gundam Online, and as far as I know, there's no real story behind it. It's just the Act Zaku, but now with a B machine gun from the Gelgoog Jaeger, with no further known modifications. Next up then, in UC 0089, it would get an actual development, the Zaku Machinery. The story takes place after the end of the first Neo Zeon War, with Neo Zeon trying to rebuild their forces. And our story specifically will be focusing on the Serana faction, a faction led by the little sister of Haman Khan, Serana Khan. So, one of the ways they tried rebuilding their forces was by getting in touch with the premier mobile suit supplier of the time, Anaheim Electronics. Not everyone in Neo Zeon was equally happy about this though, cause, you know, they still saw them as the driving force behind the Aeug, but they had to do what they had to do. Anaheim, on the other hand, seemed to be quite happy to provide them with a new mobile suit, and even offered them a deal so good they just couldn't refuse. Of course, Anaheim being Anaheim, they didn't do this out of the kindness of their heart. Providing the Neo Zeon stragglers with a fighting chance would prolong the conflict, which was in the interest of Anaheim's finances. But anyways, the Zaku Machinery. The original prototype was still immediately recognizable as an Act Zaku, but if you look closer, you'll start noticing more and more differences. What happened is that Anaheim Electronics got their hands on an Act Zaku and reverse engineered it. They then modernized and upgraded it into the prototype for the Zaku Machinery. So even though at its core it was still an old machine, it was capable of keeping up with modern machines if used correctly. Thanks to the magnet coating, it had excellent maneuverability, exceeding that of many contemporary machines, and thanks to its reactor, it could use modern beam weapons. Where it falls a bit short then is that it still used the Act Zaku's older armor, and that its raw firepower is inferior to that of the Zaku 3. It was a bit of give and take, but overall, Neo Zeon was very pleased with what they saw, and the prototype Zaku machinery would be approved for further development into the Zaku machinery mass production version. It's hard to say how much the internals and performance were changed, but its armor at the very least got a pretty drastic overhaul. It now looks much more like a standard Zaku 2 than it does the Act Zaku. As for its weapons then, its standard loadout does feel rather antique. It uses a Heat Hawk, which could be stored on the side skirt, and a slightly upgraded Zaku machine gun, which could be stored on the left shoulder armor. Nothing that screams high performance, but in combat, they would prove to be highly effective, as shown by the Royal Guard using these machines. It was even said that they were as powerful as the later Gira Doga. And for ace pilots, they could be upgraded a little bit more, because alongside the base machines, they also ordered optional parts. Unfortunately though, we only see these appearing on one specific unit, the Zaku machinery piloted by Ernardo Bat, the captain of the Royal Guard. At first, the modifications were only minor. He had a commander antenna and a beam sniper rifle. But later on, the changes would be much more striking, and quite literally so, because the two main upgrades were seemingly inspired by the Hyakushiki. It got a very Hyakushiki-esque backpack and beam-resistant coating, giving it a golden color scheme. The other upgrades were a Marseille-styled head, complete with Vulcan guns, external fuel tanks, and a larger backskirt, which, according to Gundam Battle Operation 2, could be used to store weapons. It's also shown to have a sealant launcher in its hands, but it's not known if this was a feature only present on this machine, or if it was also present on the standard Zaku machinery. And for all we know, it might have even been installed on the Act Zaku, because we do see these kinds of sealant launchers on other mobile suits all the time. And that is where the development history of the Act Zaku ends in the main timeline. But let's also have a quick look at how things went in the origin timeline. In the main UC timeline, we still had some unanswered questions remaining surrounding the Act Zaku. Source A says this, Source B says that. But in the origin, they are more precise about certain things. So, the Peasant project here is described as being a top secret plan designed to break the deadlock with the Federation. And the MS-11 Act Zaku was part of this project as a next generation successor to the Zaku. It was developed as a close combat machine that would be able to use beam weaponry thanks to its new high power fusion reactor. And it would have a joint drive system using the same field motors as the Federation mobile suits. But here's the thing, I couldn't find any mention of the machine using the magnet coating. But so, according to the official website, development of the Act Zaku was actually going really well. But apparently, not well enough. The reactor and the new thrusters were delayed, and it didn't look like the Act Zaku was going to be rolled out on time. So, the decision was made to make somewhat of an interim unit, the Act Zaku Kycilia Forces version. Basically, they took what they already had and completed it with standard Zaku 2 parts. This meant that this version of the Act Zaku had a Zaku 2 backpack, a Zaku 2 reactor, and Zaku 2 shoulder armor. This unit was later classified as a prototype unit and given the model number YMS-11. And because it was part of Kycilia's forces, they gave it a crest-like decoration on its head, which was like the hallmark of Kycilia's forces. One completed Act Zaku did allegedly participate in the Battle of Abawaku though. This unit was, allegedly, used by Warrant Officer Vasily Bosch and was outfitted with a beam rifle, a Gelgoog shield, and 2 beam sabers. And unlike the mainline version, where we don't know where the beam sabers are stored, the beam sabers here are stored on the back skirt. And that has been all for the Act Zaku's development history. the mobile suit that was originally meant to become the Gelgoog. So be sure to join me next time to see how the actual Gelgoog came to be. Don't forget to check out NordVPN with the link down below, or the code kkrt. As always, a big thank you to the Patreon supporters. I hope everyone watching has a great day, and I'll see you all next time.